In any extended conflict, China controls the outcome. There's 57 pages of weapons systems that the U.S. is 100% dependent on China for. These don't even include the stuff that the soldier in the field carries, his communication or targeting systems. All of these also require rare earths. There's 100 systems. Every one of them is 100% dependent on China. We need to find a champion who's going to stand on the floor of the Senate and say, we're either going to solve this problem, or I'm going to order the Inspector General to do a criminal probe of every defense contractor breaking the law. We need that person who can actually demand that we solve the problem or we apply the law.
Rare earth materials are used by American manufacturers to make high-tech products like advanced batteries that power everything from hybrid cars to cell phones. We want our companies building those products right here in America.
Rare earths are metals. While they're still part of the periodic table, they actually have their own little box at the bottom. There is much more desire for the heavier rare earths. We use those things in all of our electronic devices.
The biggest uses of rare earths are for the electronics and auto industries, and much of that is actually made in China. In the end, everyone still gets their television set.
At first, we told members of Congress how important it was economically. They didn't get them excited. So then we said to them, look, it's undeniable that rare earth issue is a national security issue, right? You have a constitutional obligation to take some action.
America's national security is very dependent right now on China.
Neodymium and samarium help the Abrams tank navigate and power some Navy ships. They make up night vision goggles and radar systems. One U.S. government report found element shortages have already delayed some weapons production.
Why are the rare earths separate from the rest of the periodic table? It's because of their electron configuration. This is why lanthanides and actinides are so important, is because they have f orbital electrons. And that is what brought modern electronics into the golden age, which we are in right now. We have 7 Fs. There's a very specific way in which the electrons add, element to element to element, as you go up in the periodic table. Look at number 7, right in the middle, gadolinium. It means that every single one of these 7 orbitals has exactly 1 electron in it, and they're all pointing up. It allows me to make this laser. If I go a little bit higher, I can make green laser light. If I go a little bit higher, I can make blue laser light. In addition to visible light, we're trying to very precisely control electromagnetic radiation, stuff that we can't see but is nevertheless light. And so that's why they are in satellite guidance systems and our cell phones and our computers. Spin up, spin up, spin up. 1 electron per orbital. And they're all pointing in one direction. That's how magnets work. And when you have per mole or per gram a lot of these that work well with other what are called high spin metals like iron, like cobalt, you have fabulous punch. You've got a lot of magnet in a very small size.
Older folks like me will recall a day when earphones didn't look like that. It was more like this, or these big things that went over our ears. The whole trick to that has been the invention of a little magnet based on neodymium iron boron magnets. Extremely powerful magnets, and they use a rare earth mineral called neodymium. One of the places they find application is in the generators that sit on top of windmills. Because if you're going to put a generator on a windmill on this really, really high stock, you want it to be as lightweight as possible.
We want our companies building those products right here in America. But to do that, American manufacturers need to have access to rare earth materials, which China supplies.
So let's find alternatives. Toyota is doing that with their car. They're trying to reduce reliance on heavy rare earths. What do you think about that as a strategy?
If you don't have access to those higher energies and the more precise control over those higher orbitals, that makes things harder. You could use, for example, lighter rare earths in combinations, in pairs, that may permit you to do that. So there's a lot of tricks that you could try and pull off. I would still submit that that's probably not going to get you what you want. We've got plenty of rare earths, but we refuse to move. And now we have national security being threatened by us buying it from what is arguably still called in very conservative circles our enemy, China. What are we doing?
Thorium is a companion element to rare earths. There is a high correlation between heavy rare earths and thorium. So generally speaking, when you are mining the much more valuable suite of heavy rare earths, you're getting a lot of thorium.
When you do monazites, you probably get about as much thorium out of the mineral as you do rare earths.
The NRC and the IAEA made some classification changes that dealt with thorium. Basically make monazites fall into the category of source material. Just prior to these classification changes, monazite represented about 50% of the world's rare earth supply. And remember, this is a byproduct. This is something that was a very low or no cost byproduct of some other mining.
Pretty much every mine is already mining rare earths. Every iron mine, titanium mine, phosphate mine, they're all producing ore that contains very large amounts of rare earths, but what they're doing is throwing that ore right back into the ground. The Bureau of Land Management sort of pretends that they never disturbed it. Otherwise, we wouldn't do any mining in this country at all. So there's no need for an independent rare earth mine. A standalone mine to mine rare earths is ridiculous. We get almost all the rare earths we need just from mining everything else.
70% of China's rare earths come from the byproduct production from an iron ore mine. So China's very heavily utilizes byproduct, co-product production to keep their costs down.
Quote unquote garbage. It's waste. It's stuff that these other mines would love to get rid of.
Why are you deliberately ignoring something that's there? Particularly here in the United States, monazite is a predominant mineral, and it's a phosphate, and it usually has one rare earth and usually one thorium atom. And so the bottleneck here in the United States has been the thorium, which is silly. Thorium really isn't a bad thing.
China's market advantage evolved from NRC, IAEA resource classification changes. They basically pulled monazite out of the value chain, and China stepped in and took advantage of this. China also implemented an aggressive top-down industrial policy, which I think was very wise. They published their objectives. Yeah, I mean, we didn't have the internet and you couldn't Google Translate, but I'm sure somebody in the Pentagon had a job to read the frickin' newspaper. It was in the newspaper. China, at the highest levels of government, decided that the rare earth industry was critically important and they intended to dominate that market. It's interesting to note that the one rare earth mine that you can see here in blue was eventually shut down not for competitive reasons or costing reasons. It was shut down because they had a thorium discharge from their tailings pipe. The EPA and environmental groups put enough pressure on them, they eventually shut down.
Right here in good old Chicago, the construction sites are halted because they find thorium and monazite sand still, oh God help us, and their remediation, of course, is insanity, where they barrel it up and send it out to Utah instead of covering it with about an inch of clay and, forgetting about it like they should. Same with these guys. The company that made the mantles moved out to West Chicago. Like any company in the 30s, just sort of threw their extra stuff out the back door. In the 1980s, they found a pile of this stuff. They freaked out. It's radioactive. Holy crap, what are we going to do? And what the company Kerr-McGee said, well, we'll cover it with about a foot of clay and some topsoil, and we'll call it a day. And people are like, you can't just do that. And it's like, well, that's how it is in nature, man. And they're like, no, it's got to be better than nature. Yeah, the trouble, it's kind of funny because if you don't laugh, you'll cry. They've spent $800 million over 30 years removing a little bit of thorium. And the trouble is they'll never, ever finish cleaning it up, right? Why would they? The checks keep coming. We're always going to find new stuff to clean up. And because you find thorium pretty much everywhere, you know, you're going to keep having to clean it up. That's the Lynas Advanced Metals plant in Malaysia. And what was their plan to store thorium? Perfectly legitimate. They were going to mix it with cement, pave, you know, tailings lake. They even going to pave roads. They're like, we'll build new roads. And they're like, you're going to make nuclear radioactive roads? It's like, all roads are radioactive, dude. There's one mine in the United States that probably has well over $1 billion of recoverable minerals in it. If somebody says, what's the liability for thorium? Well, it's at least more than $1 billion because they won't recover those minerals because they'll have a thorium problem afterwards.
To avoid liabilities, U.S. and global financial markets favored rare earth projects with low thorium content, not high-value rare earth distributions. This is the largest rare earth mine operating in the United States, and I want to point out that this is only half of the rare earth elements. This is the lighter value, lower value portion. The only heavy rare earth that they claim to be able to produce is almost invisible right there in that little sliver. These deposits don't contain the heavy rare earths. This is the economic rare earths that are needed if you want to be part of any modern economy. This is what's being mined today by Western companies trying to avoid thorium. It's about the value chain, right? The only operating rare earth mine in the United States sends all of their valuable resources to China for processing. Now, the people in the Department of Defense and people in Congress don't know that. They think that company is supplying the U.S. value chain, which is supplying the military. And when we show them that it's, in fact, the opposite, they are part of the Chinese monopoly. You're taking powder, and they ship it to China, and it comes back as a magnet or an alloy or a bolt-on component. If we can't do the sophisticated stuff, we're cavemen.
So what are we going to do? We worked on this ridiculously over-the-top facility for storing thorium.
If we could take care of the thorium in a place, in a special bank, with lots of protection, which is totally unnecessary, but I mean, that's how, if we need it to be safe, then that's fine, that's how you do it, fine. If we can get that, then we could process millions and millions of metric tons of rare earth containing soils here in the United States. And you can have all the rare earths you want.
We had a bill written and then worked very diligently with House and Senate members to get the bill introduced in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. A bicameral, bipartisan congressional briefing, heavily weighted with MLAs, which are military legislative assistants. The folks on the Armed Services Committee take their job very seriously. We had a fantastic congressional briefing. We felt like we'd hit a home run. We felt like we would get unanimous support for inclusion. If we had succeeded, the rare earth bill would become law. We would have been able to solve the rare earth problem. What happened, unfortunately, is that 2 or 3 days after the briefing, we were notified by the senator who sponsored the bill. We were notified by his office that the Department of Defense, not a senator, not a staff member, but the Department of Defense intervened to kill the bill, communicated to the members of the Armed Services Committee that they didn't want this bill. This is problematic. Any estimates by our own government for organically building an alternative value chain are estimated to be 7 to 15 years.
The Department of Defense, due to the dearth of the heavy rare earths, and rare earths in general, there are a couple of particular really goody rare earths, just bought their supplies from China for their F-22 fighter.
You mean the components?
The actual components that contain the rare earths. Well, that's absurd. That's national security. You've now told them one of your components on a very advanced machine that protects our country. You just told them what it is. You just told them how to make it. You just bought it from them. That's just one example. Are we going to do that for hundreds of components, thousands of components that belong on the avionics of our most advanced weapons?
Why do we need this bill? Oh, because we're 100% reliant on China. So what's a pivot to Asia mean? It's a pivot to nowhere. Because what are we going to do? Are we going to get into a proxy war with China? Are we going to get into an actual shooting war with China? Okay, can we time out? Can you give us some more gyroscopes so we could build more cruise missiles to launch at you? I bet they don't give them to us.
It's either the defense contractors trying to maintain a cozy, or let's call it a very awkward and uncomfortable relationship with China, or someone in the Defense Department hiding 25 years of failure. I don't know which it is, but by killing the bill, what they've done is they've locked us into Chinese dependence in perpetuity. If we can't break the chain now, it doesn't get easier tomorrow.
And you need to demand that someone in the United States Congress enforce the law and end this practice. Anybody with a box of crayons needs to start writing op-eds. And you need to send them to your local paper, and you need to send them to national papers, because the only way we can change the decision by the Department of Defense is to call them out. Right? They made this decision, and nobody in this room is supposed to know about it. Right? You're never supposed to know that the Department of Defense injected itself into the legislative process to hide 25 years of policy failure. There's a very good paper you can get off my website, came out of India, that said, regardless of who develops new rare earth applications, technologies, metallurgy, all of the benefits accrue to China because they're the only place in the world that has a value system to develop them. So what's the point of a national lab? What's the point of anybody's work in here if we're dealing with advanced technologies that require any rare earths?
So that's where we're at. We basically are looking for a single member of Congress who's willing to force the defense industry to follow federal law.
But if there was an argument put forward, I can only assume it was pertaining to thorium, right? I mean, what other argument are you going to possibly have?
No one opposed to the bill on the bill's merits. The DOD doesn't take a policy position on thorium because it's not the EPA, because it's not the NRC. When the Department of Defense inserts itself, it can only be acting or imposing or communicating concerns related to national security.
There had to be some reason articulated to someone.
When we ask who, what, or why, we were told you're best off finding that answer out on your own. We won't comment on it. The bottom line is there's no rationale for killing a bill that ends U.S. dependence on China for these important materials. The bill was budget neutral. The bill had bipartisan support. The bill had support of senior members on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Federal law requires defense contractors use U.S. or allied parts and components. So, can the Defense Department object on some theoretical ground, but say that we want to maintain a status quo where every day, every defense contractor in the United States is violating federal law?
How is this working out for like you and John? Because you guys probably have the most, I guess, most invested in this in terms of time and effort. What's the emotional toll anyway at this point?
Yeah, it's a tough thing to shake. The accepting the position we're in today is accepting a subservient and declining role for the United States, and unless I'm willing to pack up my family and leave and live in some other country, that's pretty daunting. It's hard to get over. China never has to go to war with us. They've already won. With their Navy, they're able to launch cargo from cargo containers into the center of our country and destroy the entire financial economic fabric of every single town in the United States. They do this by displacing jobs, offshoring jobs, and causing the unemployment and economic hardship all across the United States. That's how powerful their Navy is. It's called a cargo container ship. And we don't have a single aircraft carrier in our fleet that's more powerful than that.
What's the next thing to do then?
Our enemy is not China. That would be unfair. Our enemy is within. 6 years, 60 trips to Washington, D.C., 250 meetings with members of Congress or congressional staff, and an intervention by the Department of Defense that assures that our dependence on China will continue and gives the entire defense industry a free pass on violating federal laws. There's got to be a congressman somewhere who cares about the national security validity of our country. There has to be a member of the Senate who believes that the defense contractors need to follow federal law. We need to find a champion who's going to stand on the floor of the Senate and say, we're either going to pass this rare earth bill and solve this problem, or I'm going to order, or the Senate, Congress is going to order the Inspector General to do a criminal probe of every defense contractor breaking the law. I don't care which bill we pass today. We're going to do one. We need that person who can actually demand that we solve the problem or we apply the law. That's it.
They got away with it because it all happens in committee. It never went to the floor. It was never open.
Right. No one
the
ever...
SAC work is all very private. I tell you the truth, I don't care which one they do. They can say, screw Jim Kennedy and the Thorium Energy Alliance. We're not going to pass that. We're going to investigate this criminal activity. I'd have a party.